Hello and welcome to We Are the Deluge, a spoiler-free chapter-by-chapter podcast about the climate change novel Deluge by Stephen Markley. We're your co-hosts, Emily Randall and John McMahon, the two most dispassionate empiricists you'll ever meet. Today, we are discussing the executive summary of legislative negotiations for the Pollution Reduction, Infrastructure, and Refund Act of 2029, set, unsurprisingly, in 2029, the second chapter from Ashir's point of view, which we are presenting in the form of an Ash report. Emily, how's your empiricism going these days?
It is dispassionate, to say the least. It's so good. Wow, that really got me. I'm caught off guard by the accusation.
And it truly is an accusation for both of us.
I know, right? Shall we begin with our abstracts?
We should. You go first.
Okay. Ash struggles with the tension between the adequate and the possible, challenging coalitional concerns with dispassionate empiricism, disappointing climate hardliners, but ultimately presenting an assessment of President Randall's climate plan that includes quite a bit of sea level rise.
I very much appreciate your attention to the conclusion, which is like a fucking kick to the face. That conclusion.
Yeah.
It's like it's maybe the second or third most like tragic 2 or 3 sentences in this entire novel is the conclusion to this chapter.
Yeah. I think my stomach literally sank. I was like, oh. But the Ash chapter, we'll get into this. The Ash chapters are so clever, I think, for it's, he's so rigorous in his own thinking, but he is not a straightforward narrator.
I'd like to think there's a little bit of that in both of us.
Oh, I love that.
As teachers, as writers, thinkers, as podcasters, clearly.
Yeah. You know what? That makes me feel better.
Great. I'm happy for that to be one of our goals. I've got, for a summary, Ashir tacks back and forth between the personal and the political. He tries to make compromises in Washington, D.C. and beyond Washington, D.C., but how does he deal with his own dispassionate empiricism?
Very good. Yeah. We're starting to get closer together.
It was inevitable, I think, that this would happen.
Indeed. Lots of characters that are introduced or reappear or change.
Yes.
We get Seth Young on the sort of personal end of the political.
That's the correct way to say it.
Yeah.
I feel like I went to college with a dozen Seth Youngs, is how I felt reading this chapter, right? So Seth Young in the book is a quote unquote recovering political operative who like runs a fitness group for people who work in DC and like government think tank worlds.
Yes.
And was like an Obama staffer, like in the Obama administration in the early years, got burnt out and got burned and has been trying to leave the game ever since, but he can't get away.
And there is a wee bit of flirting.
More than a wee bit.
Yeah. We learn a little bit about Ashir's sexuality in this chapter too, kind of explicitly, but also in a lot of wink, wink, nudge, nudge delivery mechanisms. So
yeah, including the recognition that part of his relationship with Peter in the first chapter, or in the time that he had written about in the first chapter, was like an actual romantic attraction or crush or something like that for him.
Yeah.
Which
then gets complicated by the reveal, which is
Peter and Ash's sister Anaya have been hooking up for years. They're in love. They got married and had a baby.
Yep. And Ash spends some time feeling resentful, but ultimately decides that it is, how does he describe it? Small of him to resent them. Mm-hmm. And now they're all like super tight. Mm-hmm. Which I think is very sweet. And I love that the drama of that is reduced to a single paragraph. I mean, also like I think he's, maybe I'm just because it's fresh in my mind, but I think of all the characters who we've encountered in book 1 and in book 2, he has sort of like changed the most in way, like as a person, in ways that he recognizes.
Ooh, I think the last part of that is crucial because as you say that, I'm struck by the fact that I think the two people that change the most from book 1 to book 2 are are Ash and Jackie, and Jackie is the last chapter in book 2.
Yeah.
But I don't
I
think
don't
she
remember
has,
Jackie's book 2 chapter, so
I
I'm
don't think
curious.
she has quite the same awareness of the change. And to, like, your point about all of that drama is boiled down to one paragraph speaks to Ash's how Mark Lee writes Ash as writing in order to deal with what's psychological complexity. Is that the phrase I think that he uses?
Yeah.
And it's only through doing that that you would possibly be able to, as a character, to do that in one paragraph.
Yep. It's good.
Yeah. So Hanaya's at a climate policy think tank, so
They
Ash
also have both
wants
gotten doctorates in the time since we last met Ash, which I think is hysterical.
impressive.
There's so many PhDs in this fucking book.
Yeah, I mean, again, like, could this go straight to our souls in a lot of ways? This book, and Peter is running a hedge fund with the modeling whatever that Ash had done for their NBA betting
So funny
scheme, which and has apparently like attracted a shit ton of investment money, according to Peter, in the most bro-y way possible.
So funny. Everything Peter says fucking slays me. I am like
his nicknames for Hanaya and is just like, and I know we got this as well in the first chapter, but his like rattling off of increasingly like tenuously connected to the person's name or the nickname that came before it names is really wonderful.
I love that kind of comedy. I find it like so smart and compelling, but how does Ash describe it? We're sort of getting ahead of ourselves in the LOL category here.
That's fine.
He has a great explanation for it. Oh, I got it. This is on 225. Peter, always a playful, slippery, logic-defying linguist, had dubbed my mother, Amala, Grandmamala, Grandmamala. Just like, what an interesting way to describe someone's intellect, because that's sort of like what he's describing, right? It's playful, it's slippery, it's logic defying, but it is a sort of like mode of cognition or intellect or like thinking.
Yeah, it's a very like excess driven, right? Let's just keep going in excess of the thing that came before it, right? So, I mean, the line that really got me from Peter is when he's trying to tell Ash that he has been having sex with Naya for a long time and is in love with her, right? It's the list of names for her. She's Hanaya, the Han Dynasty, Han Solo, Harrison Ford, Ford Fusion EV, of course, range of 340 miles.
So good.
It's great. So it's really good stuff. Yeah.
Well, I guess in true academic fashion, we have an overbloated abstract, but
I think we can just say it was on purpose.
Yeah, it was intentional. We also have a bunch of new politicos that appear in this chapter. Is Jane, how do you pronounce that?
I'd go with Tufariello.
Wait, say again?
Tufariello.
Tufariello, okay. She's a new mentor of Ashir's, right? She's not the mentor from before.
She got him into the NOAA
after,
right, and as a mentor.
Grad school.
Yeah, correct.
Okay,
yeah, I think
okay.
I maybe this is not actually there, and it's just like me mapping out people in grad school, but it's like that's the postdoc mentor. Right?
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Equivalent.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And she's also working on this climate bill.
Yes. And is the one that gives the most of a shit about it being a good bill.
Right.
Out of these other people.
But does she work for any of the electeds officially, or she works in the capacity of the group that's running the modeling and working in conjunction with the people actually writing the policy?
I think the latter.
The latter. Okay. Because Ashir is working for the senator.
Yes.
Yeah.
For Fitzpatrick.
Then we have Joe Otero, he's the one who's like
listened to a lot of Blink 182 back in the day, and now is a like moderate conservative staffer.
And he's the aide for the Senate leader, so that makes him a Republican?
Yes.
So hold on, let me map this. So we have a Republican president who won on climate change.
Yep.
With the aid of Fierce Blue Fire.
Yes.
We have a Democratic House.
I think that's the implication, if not what's actually stated.
And a Republican Senate.
Yep.
Okay. Interesting. It's giving France.
Who's Macron in this analogy?
Know. Yeah. Okay, so the presumption is that the Senate leader is a conservative, right?
Yes, I think so. Yeah. We've got Kay Martine, who is the staff director for the Energy and Commerce Committee on the Democratic side. And she's constantly in a rivalry with Joe Otero and also...
/ flirtation ship?
Yes. I think that's a great ship to lay out there. And also is creeped on by Marty Rathbone.
Yes. Why is Marty Rathbone in the room?
Because... he's going to be on he's going to head the National Economic Council or something. Okay.
So he's going to be an executive appointee.
Yes, I believe so.
Okay. It's really hard. I ostensibly have a PhD in political science.
Oh, you do? Yeah.
It's hard to keep track of all this shit. Who works for who now and what side? Okay. We also have Alice McCowan, who's Randall's advisor. President Randall's advisor. It's hard to say Randall. Sounds like a lot like Randall. And she
has the most colorful lines of all this cohort.
Yes. But I had a hard time getting a read on actually her politics, right? Like she's obviously advisor to a Republican president. So she's sort of right, Ash says that he perceives her persona as kind of put on, but very committed to. And in part as a strategy for her kind of moderate social values or something. But
yeah,
what does that mean?
Well, she's a lesbian, right? We take that to not just be a phrase, but she's actually a lesbian. Right. Which I don't know. There's something interesting about the fact that Joe Otero and Alice McCowan would be interpreted as signs of a quote unquote post-Trump Republican Party, as is Randall's election, obviously, in the world of this book. So there's this imperative of we are past the Trump years for the Republican Party as a whole. Obviously, there's Murkowski and all of the white supremacists and Jennifer Braden as the media figure. That's not gone away.
In the slap universe.
Yeah.
In the slapverse.
We have to call it only that from now on this podcast. No other terms are allowed. So they're all still there, but you have Otero and McCowan is think Markley trying to imagine what it would look like.
Well, and she's a Texas lesbian, right? Mm-hmm. So it's okay, does that mean she hates the queers or what? I don't know. What kind of lesbian are we supposed to read her as? Is I think open ended.
It's a great question.
And I don't think Ash really knows. So
same.
Yeah. Are we missing anything?
No, I think we can add to the body of the report. So as is clear to the audience and to each other, the thing that maybe stands out to both of us as one of the most significant, if not the most significant things happening in this chapter is the way in which Ash repeatedly, over and over again, argues for the most scientific understanding of climate and of politics.
Yeah.
And that gets him into trouble with both other politicians and with other scientists, as he is at the always existing but always acknowledged nexus of both, shall we say.
Yeah.
So I thought I might just give a couple examples, and then I want your actual expert opinion on how to make sense of them all.
Okay. I have a lot to say.
So we've got 217, right? He is talking about how all we need to do is just run the numbers, figure out what is the best policy empirically, and do it, right? To spend our time dawdling about political constituencies seems to me rather fruitless, right? It's a classic kind of consequentialist, right, sort of calculation. On 220, he talks about this need for dispassionate empiricism, right? That's the only way to go. That's all that you need. 219, 220, right? And as he says, after he claims that the online left thinks that he's a stalking horse for neoliberalism, which is also
incredible
a consideration for the funny thing in the headline for us.
Yeah.
So as I've tried to make clear to politicians and activists alike, science and advocacy make poor bedfellows no matter the circumstances. Dispassionate empiricism is the only methodological approach that should be pursued.
But I would like to pair that with the ending sentence to the paragraph before,
Which is,
yes, clearly the conservative movement and its proxies practice bad science, but the so-called climate hawk community is often guilty of the same.
yes, which is this. He makes that point twice, right? Because he had
Mhm.
made that point at the very beginning of the chapter as well.
Yeah.
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 He's got 229, right? Now he's talking with Tony. He says, all right, we're just going to present all the politicians with firm evidence of how the legislation will affect climate processes, and it'll just happen, right? And then like the kind of closing is, this is an inner monologue to himself, right? He says that you can either view the world empirically, or you can view it through your ideological preferences, but that those are completely separate from each other.
Yeah.
So like those were all the like him working through that idea in this chapter, and I'm interested in how you would like grapple with that.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, he's wrong,
Yes, obviously.
but I think it's not maybe for like the reason he thinks someone would accuse him of being wrong.
Ooh, I'm gonna press you to say more to that, but with a particular like audience in mind, right? So when I taught environmental political thought last year, one of the hardest things for my students to wrap my head around was this like interpolation of science and politics stuff. And
Yeah.
part of it was the failure of their interlocutor, i.e. me. So I'm like also asking this for self-interested reasons, but like, how would you explain to a student that that's wrong? Or how have you?
I think
more to the point.
what's really hard is, so first of all, like I spent a whole dissertation trying to figure out like what work the words bad science do politically, right? And by politically, I mean for knowledge, not for policy making. So I mean politically in the like feminist critical theory sense.
Yes.
But I think Ash actually, when he talks about bad science, what he means is that is a science that claims neutrality when it is not neutral. But Ash's faux pas is thinking that there is a science that is neutral. So he's conflating, right, two things. He's conflating the promise of a kind of like
view from nowhere
with the way that ideas or perspective or standpoint or bias, whatever kind of epistemic tool you want to use to cut it, works in the knowledge production process. So I think he's absolutely right when he says a lot of people are doing bad science, and absolutely wrong when he says that science and politics are bad bedfellows. And in fact, I mean,
that's kind of the perfect, like that's in some ways, as theorists, that's exactly what we want, is somebody who is precisely wrong and precisely right at the exact same time. That's our dream.
I mean, I'm like smiling so widely right now because it's just like delicious, right? I just like felt like in my Carol Gould era. In that moment.
Would you say it's a juicy point?
Yes. It's a very juicy point. But I think so. Okay, so this is sort of like the thing that feminist science studies struggles with, right? Feminist philosophy of science. This idea that on the one hand, I think most people would find the claim that like science historically has been used for purposes that further social agendas that are violent and hierarchical in nature, oppressive, exploitative, etc. Right? So the easy examples are, right, like experimentation, right? Gynecological experimentation on women of color from the assumption, right, that they are constitutionally different and thus like able to withstand, right, levels of pain or however you cut it, that white women are not, right? And all like for the purpose of the eugenic science that then serves the assumption that motivates it in the first place, right? So so that's like a clear example of bad science, right? The assumption the political assumption that the science justifies comes before the science itself, right?
Mhm.
And it's very clearly ethically problematic, right? Like you should not
Yes.
experiment on people. And like science, like any system of knowledge production, has rules, right? And so like to do good science means to follow those rules. And ethics are part of those rules, which is also something that Ash is like not thinking about, right? And
Right.
maybe that's because models don't have ethics, but I don't know. Maybe they do. Let's
They
put a pin in
do.
that.
Okay, I've got a potential theory example to talk about that with. Yes.
Okay. The other examples, right? Like Tuskegee syphilis
Yep.
experiments, right? Like knowingly withholding treatment that could save somebody's life to see just how the disease. I mean, I assume our listeners probably know what that is, right? But this historical example where the whatever hospital or entity that was conducting the study on syphilis, right, like infected all these black men with the syphilis, and then like pretended to give them drugs to right to cure it, or maybe they collected people who already had syphilis. The details at the moment are escaping me because I feel very fired up. But basically, withheld treatment, knowing the treatment would work, just to study the progress of the disease, right? So, and like things like that, people are like, oh, this is a clear violation. Or people I think are even willing to concede that things like gynecological science more broadly, or like the women's health treatment more broadly, is sort of bad science because like there are no women that are there, or historically there hadn't been women who were like medical doctors, and so the ways in which men study women's bodies and medical needs is obviously circumscribed by the fact that they don't have those embodied experiences or those needs, right? And like most people are willing to concede that like those are problems.
Yeah.
But most people want to say that that's just bad people doing science badly, not science as usual, right?
Following you. Yep.
So feminists have tried to say, what if it is science as usual? How could we do science better so that it doesn't, as a rule, right, engage in those forms of harm? So people have proposed all sorts of things, right? Like a feminist empiricism has been a proposal, right? So this and like people, it means different things to different people, right? But it means that like feminists actually have an interest in doing empirical work because
Absolutely.
there are empirical phenomena that are interesting to feminists, to people who are interested in gender equality and in overturning patriarchy and understanding oppression. That
Hmm.
there are empirical questions that flow from that that are of interest to feminists, and thus feminists need to do empirical work. That's sort of one kind of like pillar of it. The
Yes.
other is that maybe we would have better empirics if our questions were specifically and intentionally ideologically motivated by something
Mm.
like the expedient political material need to like fight patriarchy, right? So now we're into like design of study
Yes.
questions, right? Like, what are we asking about the world? Who is responsible for collecting, right? Seeing like what there is to be collected, and what frameworks through which are we interpreting that data?
And then, like the feminist question, of course, what are the epistemological assumptions buried within, particularly
Right.
that final question?
Right. But there is a sort of paradox that flows from that, right? Like if empiricism's claim to authority in describing the world is that it is not contingent on who does it. It's right replicable. It like many different people can do the same study and come to the same conclusion, right?
Hmm.
That's when we have something that approaches like a rule or a law, right? Then to say that like who does it matters undermines the claim to authority that it rests on in the first place, right?
And
Um,
also undermines, and this is, I think, there are a couple of pieces I have in mind, but it's like simply saying, we'll just trust the science as the political answer to what to do to like mitigate climate change.
yeah,
It can't work, right?
right.
To say, because it assumes that separation, right? That
Yes.
epistemological and ideological and material gap
Yeah.
between the science and the politics.
Yeah. So feminists have really struggled with how to defend a specifically feminist empiricism. I think for the most part, feminists who are theorists of knowledge and practitioners of science say you don't have to throw them both out, right? Like you can concede that like, yeah, maybe it slightly undermines the authorial claim, right, of an empiricism if you specify, right, the location or the whatever of the knower, of the observer, but that doesn't mean that it's a less valuable description of reality.
Mm-hmm.
So some people have like said, we're fine with it. Let's just keep doing this. This is good science. I think other people have been called to the like more sort of postmodern, right, like ways of investigating reality. So it doesn't look necessarily in terms of design and method like a formal scientific investigation, but there's like we attend to language, or we look at science itself as a text that can be submitted to critical engagement and reading, and that then can help us produce knowledge about other things like knowledge, power, oppression, etc.
Yep.
Sorry, now I'm lecturing you. Usually I drink more water before before I give a lecture.
I'm here for it.
I didn't mean to do this. I'm getting carried away. But then you go to something like feminist standpoint theory, right? Which says, like, borrowing from the Marxist tradition, that there are like actually, this is like a very vulgar simplification, but there are certain phenomena in the world that are only visible from the perspective of people who are oppressed, right? So for Marx, right, we cannot view capitalism unless from the perspective of the worker.
Yep.
For feminists, we cannot view patriarchy except from the perspective of women. For Black feminists, we cannot view the intersection of sexism and racism except from the perspective of Black women, right? Like that there are like literal things that we cannot study unless we study them from the marginalized, the oppressed, the people who have historically also been barred from access to institutions of knowledge making.
Yep.
And so like some people want to say, well, that's not science, which like, fine, whatever. But like, surely that bears on the project of something like doing a feminist empiricism, or like a critical race empiricism, or like an empiricism that is attuned to social and political needs, or social and political hierarchies, or asymmetries in power, right? That like, it's not just we need more women to like go to Harvard and work in labs. It's that like we need people who live in like poor rural places to ask questions about the world to be studied, right? Which is slightly different. And there's the problem of money, right? So like science is not like an anthropomorphized like cyborg entity with consciousness that speaks authoritatively from the view from nowhere. It's a way of making knowledge about the world, a practice, a set of rules, a tradition, right? It's also like institutions that are grounded in, housed in, dependent on other institutions. And like to make science, you have to have money. To convince someone to give you money, you have to ask a question that they think you should be asking, right? And that these are like features of the process itself. They're not accidents. I'm going to go back to the abolitionists here for a second.
Okay.
If you recall our last episode, this is like on my mind right now. Okay. So one way of thinking about slavery in the US was to say, like, how did we do this in a context where we're, this is a little bit of the like mythos of the nation kind of way of querying it, but like we have this system built on the fundamental centrality of freedom and equality, and then we also have this like incredibly, morally grotesque institution that explicitly, systematically, and violently violates those rules. How did we get here, right? And one answer is like hypocrites, right? People who want freedom for themselves but don't care about freedoms for others. So it's a kind of like individual level explanation. One explanation is like, oops is sort of like a bad accident, right? Like, and I think we're a little bit in the like liberal tradition in America debate, right? Is liberalism the dominant framework, or It,
Yeah.
is the other tradition of like descriptive hierarchy, right? A second separate tradition that interacts with liberalism or whatever. This is like APT, like 101 for undergrads,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So,
Louis Harrison, Roger Smith,
mhm. So like one answer is like it's a sort of accident. There are older like traditions of racism and stuff that are separate from liberalism. So the task of liberalism is to conquer those other things, right? And the other
Yeah.
answer is it's endemic to liberalism,
Mhm.
right? That the terms and conditions of freedom are already inscribed with those hierarchies that legitimate that, right? And I think about that as like as a analogy or a relevant analogy for thinking about the problem of like science and politics, right? Like one answer is um like sometimes bad people do science badly, right? And sometimes they do it badly on purpose, sometimes they do it badly because they're dumb, right? Or like I don't know. Sometimes they do it badly because they're biased, right? Or the answer is like, okay, we have politics and we have science, and like politics regulates science or science regulates politics. So like it gets messy because political interests are not always overlapping with scientific interests. And so they're like at odds. But I think this is like a weird, like, I don't know, like ascribing agency, like a singular agency to these institutions and like sort of negating the problem, the messiness of like the actors, right? So
Yeah.
one answer is just like all bad actors. One answer is that like these institutions have different needs. And then there's like a third answer, which is that like science is always already politics. And if we do not take that seriously, then we cannot like grapple with how to describe the world in a way that like absolves us of guilt when we do it, when we make bad descriptions. Do you know what I mean? Sorry, I'm getting way into the weeds here. Please stop me.
Well, so I want to pick up one of that last thread and think about how Markley is engaging some of these questions. And I think there are at least two things that are particularly at work in the way he does that. One is simply that, like, in its very existence, this chapter potentially posits or assumes that the environmental humanities are a necessity to gain the standpoint on some of these
Yes.
questions about science and politics.
Yes.
Right? Like, I think that's kind of implicit in the act of writing this chapter, engaging these questions in the way that he does in this chapter and in future chapters. Right? Like, we don't have to say exactly how or why, but like this is, I think, a consistent theme, particularly in the Ash chapters through the entirety of this novel.
Yeah.
Right. So I think that's kind of point number one, is one about the environmental humanities. Then the second is that Tony as the counterpoint is a kind of bonkers but brilliant
Yes.
decision for a couple of reasons. One is that Tony, I think, points out why that sort of assumption about dispassionate empiricism makes for bad science. Because you have Tony in this chapter identifying all of these times, right? Some of which are in our world of like you and I podcasting, and some of which are specific just to the world of the Deluge, where the assumptions of dispassionate empiricism consistently lead to under forecasting
Yes.
the rapidity of climate change
Mhm.
and the effects of climate change
Mhm.
on all sorts of systems within the world.
Yeah.
Right. And that I don't know if like the character Tony Beatrice would make that point so directly.
Yeah.
But I think that
That is the
Markley
point.
contrasting Tony with Ash in the way he does in this chapter makes that point.
Yeah.
And at the same time, Tony is doing so in the context of like doing some like Deleuze Delanda stuff about complex systems.
Yeah.
Right. And, he's like doing, science and technology studies stuff. Like, we have these complex systems and multiple processes and feedbacks, which I'd point out is the name of book 2 of this novel, that, as he says, quote, exhibit emergent behavior, which is like actually a very specific phrase in like complex systems
Yeah.
theory stuff across a number of different disciplines and like theoretical or philosophical orientations. And then third, this is a bonkers choice to have Tony be the bearer of all of this,
Right.
because he's hated by everyone in this book, right? Like, the left hates him for the shit he said about Randall. The right hates him because he's the biggest climate hawk. Randall somehow oddly likes him and wants his, which is a fascinating choice by Markley, and wants his opinion on this bill. So like he is a deeply flawed human who nonetheless like has somewhat pierced the veil of the absolute separation of science and politics.
Yeah.
And yet he is the one that is outside of the room where the negotiations are ongoing.
But I think that's actually the most realistic part of this chapter.
That's true. That's true.
Arguably. I mean, and a lot of it is so hyper realistic, it's unsettling, right?
Markley hates our political process so much.
But he also paints so many of the actors very sympathetically.
Which is a strength of this book throughout its entirety.
Yeah.
Can I offer, in true Ash style, a digression into my cultural artifact?
Yes, please.
At this precise moment. Okay, so I was really struggling on this one, but what I ended up settling on was, and this is extremely like basic in the hashtag sense of basic for me, is the show, but not the novels of Three Body Problem. Because I think that there's a way in which that, and again, I'm just talking about the television show. I have not read the books. I apologize. Right? It makes me a bad, occasional environmental political theorist, occasional environmental humanities knower. But there's a way in which that show engages questions about scientific knowledge in cliche ways that maybe a little bit parallel how Tony is kind of a cliche, right? The out of touch, like male savant academic, right? Who's an asshole but gets a lot of stuff right. Like that's a kind of stock character, as we've talked about even on this podcast. But there's something a little bit cliche about Tony, and like the Three Body Problem is a show I really enjoyed. I'm not sure it's a great show, right? To use a very well-worn distinction, but there's something about its relationship to the act of creating science and why we do it and how we do it, and the relationships of humanity, extra or post-humanity, and knowledge that are implicit in the creation of scientific knowledge that I think asks some of the same questions as the Deluge and asks some of the same questions of this very particular chapter. And then also there's something about the like melange of characters in Three Body Problem who have a much closer relationship to one another than at the start of the book, the main 6 POVs of the Deluge have. But there's something about the like, and then granted, I recognize that in the novel, right, it's very different than in the show because we've transported them to London as opposed to all being Chinese and many other factors, right? But like for the London-based version of the show, that like you have people you have the person in academia, you have the kind of fuck up, you have the people doing like research science, you have some of the same, but you have the people in private industry, like you have some of the same characters played off one another and more closely bound together. So like there's something about the relationship that show has to science and the way it's working on characters that I think takes it to this particular chapter. And like I a little bit want to do some specific character mapping, but I'm going to not do that.
Why not? I haven't watched the show. Should I watch it?
I think it's worth watching. Like some of the visuals are truly astonishing. And like one of my tests is is a show working for me or on me is like, does it make me cry at least one time? And like this one did. So
that's gonna be way too low of a threshold for me. Like I'll cry at literally like the dumbest MTV show for teens you've ever seen. Yeah.
I just watched. Actually, no. I think I'm going to use this as my cultural artifact for the next chapter. So I will save that. So I'm not go into the sub-digression I was going to make.
The cultural artifact that I had thought about doing does not intersect with that same set of themes precisely, but I was going to make a plug for not Snowpiercer the movie, which gets talked about in this in this chapter, or Snowpiercer the show, but the French graphic novel that it's actually based on,
which I haven't read. Yeah.
Okay, but the astonishing thing about it is that it was published in 1982. And it is like, I mean, it's about like a new ice age. So it's very like Cold War circumscribed environmental disaster, but it's a climate change. I mean, it's like
Yes.
the climate, we did something to, to the climate that was not like an accidental effect of war, right? Although like accidental effects of war are also part of, right? And I put accidental in like the biggest fucking scare quotes that abound, but like, I mean, I've been thinking about this a lot. Like when war is happening, climate change is worsening, and we're spending less time thinking about climate change. So it's sort of like worsening kind of in a couple directions.
Yeah. I mean, just imagine my joy when in back-to-back chapters, I got Parable of the Sower into Snowpiercer mentioned. And I was like, students, what are we reading and watching later this very semester?
Yeah.
It was that felt great. Snowpiercer was a complicated movie to show to students, but
I bet. I haven't seen it in a while. It came out.
I made the mistake of I hadn't watched it since like, I watched it probably a year or two after it came out and watched it once more soon after that and then hadn't since then. That was a mistake.
What in particular was?
I forgot how gory the fight scenes are.
Oh, okay. Yeah. You just felt sort of like guilty not having prepared them well for
I gave them a content warning ahead of time and like said, if you end up needing to like take an alternate thing, we can figure something out for this. For this. But and one student did take me up on that. But after the first half of the movie, she's like, I can't. So
yeah, interesting. Yeah, the graphic novel is probably obviously not as violent, right? Just in terms of the visceralness, I think, of violence, but it's also like the sort of driver of the motion of the plot is like puzzles, and they're like urgent puzzles, right? Like it's like we have problems that we need to solve, but it's more of like a more adjacent to not like a mystery, but like an action movie about solving problems than it is like about the kind of violence. And I think oh my God, I just forgot the director's name.
Of Snowpiercer?
Yeah.
Bong Joon-ho.
Oh, right. So like he goes from making that to Parasite, right? And like I think the way he explores class politics is like at the level of the body. And I mean, I read him as like dramatizing the violence of class conflict at the level of the body, right?
Yeah.
That's like his general kind of mode of storytelling. The graphic novel is much more about like how to solve these problems, right? And it is like, I mean, it's like fast paced and there is a lot of like stuff that goes on, but like, what do you do when you are in this context that you're suffering these side effects? And like, I mean, I think it's more in line with the like policy conundrums of this chapter than the movie. This
exact same segue I was going to make. I love it.
If that makes sense.
Yes, it does.
So I think it's interesting that Peter brings up the movie and Peter's like, I don't know, whatever. It looks kind of nice at the front of that train, right?
Four out of 5 train compartments seem pretty great.
And like, what a funny, like sardonic take at, or like attempt at levity in the face of this disaster, right? Like, would it really be so bad to live on that Snowpiercer train? Like you've seen it, right? I don't think
party looked pretty good, but
I love a party. But I think the source material is interestingly like kind of more in line with the chapter itself than the movie, which is the thing that Peter name drops. So
yeah. At the policy level, this chapter, there's some hardcore pandering to political scientists. Yeah. Right. There's a Tata Scotch Bowl mention, which we love, obviously. Yes. And then there's the Senate is an anachronistic and anti-democratic institution, which is just, stock phrase for us at this point.
Yeah.
I also appreciated the sick burn he gave the Inflation Reduction Act. This is Seth on page 221. I'll have to look up the exact quote, but and this is too, I watched an interview with him where he talked about, one of the many, 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 many challenges writing this book is that as he's kind of getting close to finishing it, the Inflation Reduction Act happens, right? And so that means he has to account for that in the many different like tendrils of this book, right? So this is Seth, talking about what the politics of the climate bill. Whichever version the Senate passes, whether it's cap and trade or tax and dividend or a set of regulations, he's going to back something else. That's the congressman. It's clever. You have these mechanisms which enviros have disagreed on going back to the 90s, and it's a surefire way to divide and conquer. Then you're back to another IRA with nothing to punish emissions.
Yeah.
Right. And like, this is a conversation I've had with students several times, that like, we can both at the same time say that the Inflation Reduction Act was the biggest climate policy and most important climate policy the American government has ever passed, and is woefully inadequate, right? Which is part of the like gut punch of that last.
Well, it doesn't have any
chapter.
teeth.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. And Hanaya says that too, right?
Yep.
She's like an economist, right? Or, I mean, I think she has a kind of interdisciplinary training, I think.
Yeah, she's like an environmental economist with emphasis on the environment, maybe.
Yeah, or she's sort of like a political economist too.
Yeah.
In a way, but not like a Marxist necessarily. I don't know, maybe she is. Maybe she is. But she says, unless you make it expensive or illegal, people are still going to burn fossil fuels, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. But I do, that struggle between what's necessary and what's possible just really struck me here as like the problem with policymaking.
Mm-hmm. And I think this is perhaps another instance of the form of literary fiction is very useful for engaging scientific questions or political questions, because this is like 223 where, Ash is arguing with everybody. I think in this case, maybe it's him and Seth talking. And Ash says, it feels as though we're constantly attempting to craft a coalition before we even have the policy in place. And Seth says, yeah, well, welcome to politics.
Yep.
Right. And that's a fascinating.
That's
okay.
Yeah.
Got it.
Which is interesting because she's a scientist, right?
Yes.
And she's like, welcome to politics.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I think it's her and Tony are the counterpoints to dispassionate empiricism. Right.
But I think like saying welcome to politics, I think means more coming from her as a scientist than necessarily coming from Seth, right? We would expect Seth to say that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he's like, what do you mean?
Yeah. But this gets back to your Ash is completely right and completely wrong.
Yeah.
Because there's, for Jane Fellow here, there's both she is absolutely right, and then like constituency building, coalition building, like is actually at the heart of politics.
Yeah.
And she's kind of exactly wrong. Like when the entire goal, outcome, right, mechanisms, the whatever, get thoroughly subsumed to that without some sort of like prefiguration or whatever the case may be. If there's this like separation between the constituency building and the policy building, the politics making, then you're going to run into problems.
Well, and I don't know if the more we read into this book, the more I'm thinking about like like analogies for climate policy with other, like, as you can tell, obviously I'm thinking a lot about like prisons and slavery and stuff and abolition.
Yeah.
But I wonder if this is a question that is specific to climate policy, like, or if the way we would answer it is specific to climate policy, like, is something better than nothing? And like, I feel like in this chapter, the answer is no. Something that is not the whole thing is nothing. There's no normative comparison. It's nothing. To pass a like this, and this is why the end of the conclusion of Ash's what does he call these again?
These reports memos,
is so gut punching, right? Because this whole time he's like, we can do this. I'm optimistic that it will pass. He's sort of come around to the idea that like the concessions that they made were necessary to get the constituency. By the time he's at dinner with Peter and Hanaya, right? Like he's basically like, we did the thing that we said we would do, right? And then the last 2 cents or the last bit of this, right? He runs it through the model. With IRA subsidies set to expire in 2032, the U.S. is on course for a 44% reduction of carbon equivalent emissions over 2005 levels by 2040.
And the funny thing is, like, I know exactly what piece Markley is getting that number from because I've used it in class. So.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good. Nice work, Mark.
The bill would accelerate that to 57%,
Oof.
according to models. Yeah.
Oof. That's rough, fucking rough.
Without a carbon tariff, it will have little effect on global emissions, and many carbon intensive industries will relocate to other countries. A range of economic impacts could emerge. The models foresee carbon concentration rising to 550 ppm by mid-century, with a range of adverse climatic effects possible, including, but not limited to, a sea level rise of 7 to 15 feet by 2100.
And like recognizing that climate change and what it causes are accelerated in this novel compared to our world, most likely. Nonetheless, like that, like I said, that's like one of the saddest, most tragic moments in this entire book.
Yeah.
Because it's like this is the policy that survives many of the attempts to water it down, certainly not all of them. And this is a watered down version of the policy that like we've been cheering on as readers, Fierce Blue Fire's advocacy for, right? And we go from 44% reductions compared to 2005 levels to 57 to 550 parts per million to 7 to 15 feet of sea level rise.
It's insane.
Mm-hmm.
It's nothing.
It's nothing. Yeah.
I don't know.
I think
If something doesn't work, then the something is nothing. Like, this is the conclusion I've drawn from this chapter.
Okay.
From the political debate, right?
Yeah.
That right? Because I think the undercurrent of what they're saying, focusing on what coalitions can we build, is something is better than nothing, right? This is the trade-off. In order to pass something, we have to make concessions, and something is better than nothing. That's implied.
Mm-hmm.
But if the something does nothing, it is nothing.
And one of the things I appreciate about this novel is that I agree with you that that's kind of the reading that Mark Lee is giving us here. And this is a novel in which we kind of have both sets of extremely understandable and to me relatable responses to that very dynamic.
Yeah.
That you have the Shane 6 Degrees response to that, which is like, fuck all of this.
Yeah.
Period.
Blow it up.
Right, literally. And then you have the Kate, like Fierce Blue Fire path, which is this is the conversation like her and her comrades were having about whether or not to endorse Randall, which is like, you know, the build the path model, right? The prefigurative model. This is, you know, that something is nothing, but something is also like constituency building, movement building, justice building, path building.
Right.
And the temptations and the limitations of both of those are, I think, on display in this novel, particularly because of the way that we get both characters reflecting on the other, or both sets of characters for the Fierce Blue Fire end of it, reflecting on the drawbacks of the other.
That's fair. Okay, fine. From within Ash's commitments and worldview, something is nothing is, I think, the conclusion of this chapter. And all the points you just flagged are also there.
Yeah.
But maybe Ash is going to become an impassioned empiricist.
That's great. That'd be a final form for him.
Mm-hmm. Should we do some theory?
Yes. I would like you to go first.
Okay, mine is like not in any way related to anything we've been talking about so far.
Neither is mine, so we're on good terms here.
Okay, I want to go to page 226 and Hanaya's relationship to her faith.
Oh, okay. I have a couple guesses where you might be going. I love this.
So Ash says, Hanaya by this point had stopped wearing hijab, but this was not an easy journey. She'd been independent-minded and rebellious the moment she could stand on 2 feet, and as a teenager had started a website with photographs displaying the difference between worship facilities for men and women in various mosques around the U.S. Women's prayer spaces, baking with no windows or air conditioning, or only one dirty sink to perform wudu. My parents and the imam were far from pleased. This defiance continued into college when Hanaya started a Muslim women's group at Michigan. Most of her activism involved combating misogyny, sexual violence, and domestic abuse. And I know Hanaya received a great deal of online vitriol, both from Muslims and their just as strident Islamophobic counterparts. She was caught between the imperative to defend her faith, which was precious to her, and to try to change the things within that faith community that she saw as unjust. She claimed that Peter, raised Irish Catholic, had been instrumental. LOL. That just like fucking made me laugh so hard, the end of that paragraph. So I want to think this part of Ash's life and Hanaya herself through Chandra Mohanty.
That was one of the things I had in mind.
Yeah.
Yes.
I had a couple of different
I was wondering if you were going to kind of go in that direction, or like a Laila Abulagod direction, or a Saba Mahmood direction. Those were the three in my brain.
I want to go Mohanty in particular because I think, right, this idea that she was experiencing vitriol from Muslims and Islamophobic counterparts, I imagine there's also another party of commentators, whether they're vitriolic commentators or not, but like white feminists in the US.
Bingo.
Yep. And I think that those also were probably there. And I think Mohanty is a really important interlocutor for thinking about actually what Muslims committed to, right, traditional gender roles, Islamophobes, and feminists actually have in common. And I think that that's what Mohanty lets us do, right? So Mohanty, very famously wrote an essay called Under Western Eyes, examining, right, the figure of the third world women in Western feminist scholarship. And then I wanted to flag also the piece that she wrote, and she wrote this in 86. And then she wrote a piece 16 years later.
I love that. I love this follow-up piece.
Called Revisiting, right, Under Western Eyes, Decolonizing Feminist Scholarship. And it's an incredible piece. I mean, the initial argument basically the initial essay made the argument, right, that white Western feminism has essentially, through scholarship, what she calls discursively colonized the experiences and struggles of non-Western women and have produced this monolithic third world woman subject. And this is a problem for like accuracy, right? And it's also a problem because it interferes with like the urgent political necessity of forming strategic political coalitions. So I thought that's the one tangential kind of relation to this chapter, right? If it is about coalition building, like how do the ways we explain and understand the world actually impede our ability to enter into political coalitions with people we might otherwise not be political bedfellows with, right? So
we were just doing Kambahi and Barbara Smith's interview in How We Get Free this week in Social Movements, which is all about that precise point from Mohanty.
Yeah. But Mohanty argues basically that there are kind of like three modes that kind of produce this thing. One is this problem of the like category woman itself, that like non-Western women are always sort of positioned in feminist scholarship in like relationships of abuse or as victims of tradition or as, right. So, and the veil is like one thing that like feminists have been obsessed with arguing over, right? This question of like, is it inherently oppressive, or is it actually, for example, if you are a Muslim woman in a non-Muslim country, like liberatory, right? In the US, is it like and this is like something that comes up after 9/11, right? Layla Ahmed, who's I can't remember if she's an anthropologist or what, but she has this essay where she talks about like interviewing young Muslim women after 9/11 who are wearing the hijab on college campuses about like why they wear it. And they all almost make political arguments, right? Like, I do it in solidarity against Islamophobia, right? Like that it has less in the foreground to do with faith and commitment to like a gender role than it does sort of flag, right? Like a resistance to a presumption about who they are from the perspective of the West, right? And so there's
a feminist standpoint thing happening there that connects back to your early discussion about science and politics and right in that precise point.
And like that's Mohanty's thing too. So like one thing is just this thing, like non-Western women are always talked about as like located in these like oppressive conditions and thus rendered always sort of victims of their culture, right? And then there's also this interesting argument that she makes that like that feminists kind of throw out some of their methodological like commitments when it comes to studying the non-Western woman, and that they just sort of like assemble, right, this category unsystematically, right? That like anytime there's like a woman in a place that's a victim of her culture, she just gets sort of added to this category of like women victimized by their culture. And so you have this sort of like assembly of proof that it is a universal condition of being a woman who lives outside the West, right? And it's like, to borrow from the feminist science study stuff, it's bad science is kind of like her argument there. And then there's all kinds of questions about like, who do we render agents of politics and resistance and all that kind of stuff. And then in the reprise, right, she talks about, I don't know, I just think it's like a really lovely essay because she's like, I was young when I wrote this, but like I think it, and I didn't know it was going to start this like crazy debate in feminist scholarship. But like, and here are some criticisms, and here's why I think I'm right. It's like sort of the essay.
It's great as a piece of writing. Yes.
But I think that I could see Hanaya having critics that were feminists, right? Like if you are a feminist and you care about what's the list of things that she cares about? Misogyny, sexual violence, and domestic abuse. Like, why do you wear the symbol of your oppression? Right?
Someone's definitely asked her that.
Right. And I think it's interesting that ultimately she chooses not to wear it also. Right. And I wonder.
And yet Peter, the Irish Catholic who helps work through her crisis of faith,
is like reading the Quran with her.
Who semi-converts, reads the Quran, and keeps halal even when Hanaya does not.
Yeah.
Is
amazing.
Yeah, true multiculturalism dream. Right?
But I do wonder if a woman who had maybe like an Islamic upbringing or who was herself, right, like devout or cared about the religion would have written Hanaya's like end as opting out. You know what I mean? Like,
ooh, yeah.
I'm just curious whether like maybe Markley unconsciously
standpoint theory comes back yet again,
right? Like unconsciously agrees with the invisible white feminist critic, which is that like it's a symbol of oppression, and so eventually her coming to grapple with it means discarding it.
Yeah, that's really good. I'm gonna similarly focus in on like just a couple of lines.
Yes.
They're mostly disconnected. Well, they're mostly disconnected from the novel, but they're, I think, perfectly connected to some of your discussion of feminist science studies and standpoint from earlier, right? So I want to think about two lines from the opening scene of this chapter where they're like in the negotiating room. And the first is from Tom Levine. Question is, who are you negotiating for here, Joe? If this is just about pleasing the literal pig fuckers from rural Missouri who think that the earth is 6,000 years old, then why waste the time? And then the second quote is Alice McCowan just tearing Ashir to pieces. Miss McCowan glared at me. Yeah? Well, let me tell you something, Dr. Dicksucker. On my daddy's farm, we used to do rectal palpitations on cows, and if you call me an idiot again, I'll come for you with two fists.
Oh my God, what are you going to do? On my mind is like, I'm so excited right now.
So I am going to turn us to Carol Adams, The Sexual Politics of Meat.
Yes.
In part because I once recommended this book to a student without giving her enough context. And then I later talked to her and she was like, at first I was like, why did you suggest I read this book? But then I started reading it and I got exactly why you suggested I read this book. So like, I felt that was a nice moment. So I wanted to honor that.
I love that.
But there's something about the conflation of violence, animality, and sex in those couple of phrases that, like, I think speaks to Markley's understanding of the political and certainly displays some of the arguments that Adams makes in this, like, now classic book, right? So, like, the terms that Adams is so often working with are objectification, fragmentation, and consumption. Right. And she like starts off by saying these are the processes by which we like make the animal, what's her phrase, the absent referent, right? The death of the animal that is the prerequisite for the meat that is eaten, but which is imagined away, right? And those are the processes. And like then she argues that those three processes, right? The objectification, fragmentation, and consumption is also what patriarchy does to the body of women.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And then like goes off on the like various resonances and like processes that, particularly those that converge between those two.
Can I just interrupt you very, very quickly?
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you know that evangelical climate change denier who I wrote about in my dissertation?
Yeah.
In one of the books where he writes about climate science, he cites her as like this one weird like paragraph where he talks about like basically like the ideologies that like it's like almost the science studies thing that they like disrupt science because of their biases against like meat or men or whatever. And she's like one of the only citations in the whole book. Isn't that crazy? Okay, carry on.
Wild.
Yeah.
And so there's something about Markley's understanding of power in here. Like I'm recalling your description of the way that Bong Joon-ho thinks about like the body and the violence of capitalism, that there's a way in which like Markley has a number of characters. Like Tony actually does this in a slightly different vein. I think Tom, who pops up in several settings now, has done this across the time. But like the vulgarity is both a show and like a show off of Markley's writing prowess, but also calling our attention to places where power is at work in ways that are like more dynamic or more like multifold than we tend to think so, right? So like I don't think it's a coincidence. I also don't think it's like necessarily intentional that like Markley uses sex / domination / meat / animal metaphors to convey that point in this particular chapter, right? But in both places you have like attempts to shut down a political negotiation and to exercise a certain multiple forms of power through the like sexualized animal metaphor. And those two lines just like got me thinking about sexual politics of meat, got me thinking about Carol Adams. So
yes. I'm a huge fan of these deep theory dives on just a couple lines. I think this is the good stuff. This is why people come here.
Is it?
Yes, I've decided.
Perfect.
Wow, this is good stuff.
Absolutely. Should we do some humor? Was Snowpiercer your cultural artifact, or did you have another one? I couldn't.
I did want the graphic novel was the one I wanted to bring our attention to, because I did think the difference between the movie and the novel is interesting in the context of this chapter. Yeah. So that was what I had prepared to talk about it, actually.
Beautiful.
Yeah. There is one little thematic thing here that I would like to maybe, I don't know if there's too much to say at this point, or maybe something. Like, I don't think it's quite in the realm of ominous foreshadowing, but I think there's a tension building that maybe we can keep track of and maybe we can ask some questions about. And there's like a vibe of paranoia that I think I'm sensing.
Yes.
So the specific kind of references to paranoia in this chapter are about Ashir's meeting with Tony is one context where we see it. So like Jane tells him, don't bring anything that connects to the whatever, right? We're
no phone, email, holo chat, or slapdish.
Yeah.
In person, make it a hotel, and pick the conference room the day of.
Yeah. And then he's sort of like, perhaps this is paranoid, but everyone frets about being monitored, blah, blah, blah. But then he starts listing like all these actual real things that are happening.
Yes.
Right. Our corporate services security industry, right, has increased its market share. You know, Lauren Victor Love, we learned, secured that Democratic Senate seat. Russia, China, Mossad have penetrated multiple presidential administrations and countless senatorial and congressional offices. Also, like, great use of penetrate. But then, you know, I walk from my office to the metro stop to go to Seth's apartment. Okay, so this is like a little wink there,
Intro,
right?
Yep.
I passed through the sites of dozens of video analytics programs, scanning multiple security cameras, processing huge amounts of data, including facial muscle observation, walking speed, heart rate, other biometric data that might indicate if an individual was nervous or ill. People move through DC as if it were still a free city. There is not a word, motion, website, photo, or sneeze that is not monitored, cataloged, and shuffled through the scrutiny of governmental and corporate AIs. And then, like, that night, I told Seth we could not see each other for the week following, as my sister and her husband would be staying with me. Just like, I don't know, that is such an interesting drop off of that, right? Like, one like a super tension building thing is to say, like, oh, I couldn't see Seth because, like, somebody's following me, right? but like that's not where he goes with it. But like, even in the op-ed that we discussed in the last episode, right, this one of the things that they talk about that we didn't actually discuss is like the threat, a looming possibility of like another pandemic, right? And that, like,
Yes.
we don't know when it will come or what it will be, right? So there's like the things that we can model, there's the things we can argue about, there's the projections that we can make, and then there's like this other thing that I think occupies like a different, like, I don't know, affective register of fear, right? And there's a tension building. Like, he's just like clocking like literally all the ways that he's being tracked, traced, studied, like cataloged, right? And like, I don't know, I'm wondering what the function of this kind of building paranoia is in the storytelling.
I think one of the things it does is give us as a reader, not that, like, Ash is an incredibly observant and thoughtful person and reflective person, right? That's well determined. But he's not a member of a domestic ecotage cell,
Right.
right? So whereas Shane cataloging or Kai cataloging all of the points, or Alan cataloging all of the points of surveillance that they came into contact with in order to meet up wherever they're meeting up as members of 6 Degrees, there's a different valence when it is somebody who is not a member of an illegal organization that is like committing sabotage.
When he's arguably a
Cataloging all those
member
things.
of
Yeah.
the other side, right? Like
Right.
the
Yeah.
entity
Like,
collecting the data,
I
or
mean,
one of the
yeah,
entities. Yeah.
he's a government official, right? Ultimately. So I think there's a little bit of that happening. So we can say yet again, it's a standpoint question. But I also just think it's okay, I'm going to make a wild analogy, right?
Okay.
Like, one of the classic and like overwrought probably at this point questions is, can we epistemologically and philosophically grapple with the scale and scope of climate change, right? I wonder if there's a little bit of an analogy to be made here, and that Markley, even if I think one way to define a climate novel is that it is trying to reconstruct our imaginations in order to do that grappling. I think there's something to be said that maybe this book is also doing that vis-a-vis surveillance, right? Like, much like this book is offering us a new kind of imagination for grappling with climate change, so too is it giving us a new form of imagination with which to grapple with the surveillance, penetrating our lives in all of these ways. In true Panopticon style, is an extremely passive and hyperactive at the same time mode of technological being.
Right. So it's not actually paranoia; it's realistic.
Right.
It's real.
It's not paranoid if they're actually persecuting.
Yeah. Ooh, I like that.
So
I mean,
that's what I got.
Markley read Foucault, right?
I mean, I think we definitively established that in the Shane chapter.
I know.
No doubts.
I'm just double checking. We still do this, right?
Yeah, we do still. And that's the first question if we were to ever be able to interview Stephen Markley. It's like,
if he's like, Stephen, you have Markley. One question. The question is, how much and what Michel Foucault did you read?
Yeah, that's it. That's all we got.
Oh, I love that.
Should we talk about the humor? I mean, we've been doing so throughout, but it's worth. You observed, I think this was maybe off air actually, that the Ash chapters are perhaps the funniest.
So funny. I like Ash is funny. Also, Peter as the conscious like foil and comedic relief of the like dry tension of the like policy process just like works so well for me. It hits.
One of the things that hits for me is Ash describing the food in like these shitty meetings.
Yes.
And not just Ash, but I think Matt was cataloging them in the Matt 2 chapter about like the terrible turkey wraps that like everybody touched, but no one actually picked up.
Yes.
And here it's like the bland turkey and portobello wraps. And like just that is giving the campus catering monopoly.
Oh my God,
like
yes.
really mediocre lunch food at some catered meeting or event you go to on campus.
Yep. I laughed at Ash referring to a fierce blue fire. That's hard to say. As a gadfly climate organization.
I really hope. Question number 2. Is that an intentional Socrates reference?
It must be, right?
I would hope so.
So good. And I also like the Alice McCowan, in addition to Dr. Dicksucker, obviously. Like one of her exclaims is "sweet brandy fuck," which I thought was so good. I really liked that. Oh, I love Seth telling Ash that he's dork famous. I was just like, that gets me. That's so funny and like so believable.
Right.
And of course he wouldn't know that, right? But like, I imagine that the second someone observes him, right, like taking notes, making one interjection that just like cuts everybody down and is straight to the point, that's fodder for gossip, right? Like, wow.
I appreciated Ash's joke in the abstract, right? Well, you love smuggling a joke in an abstract. Yet I now realize my years spent modeling the Googleplex's worth of interactions within various Earth systems models for NOAA was small bore. A joke. Apologies. It's like
so good.
It's a nice pun, and then he calls attention to it and apologizes for it. This was also a very endearing, to me at least, Ash chapter.
Yeah, I agree.
In part because of like moments like that.
To bring it back to, oh my God, what's the name of the Carol Adams book? Sorry, just like lost.
Sexual Politics of Meat.
I really like when Seth offers to pay for dinner and then orders for Ash, and then Ash at the end says, "I prefer actual cow flesh."
Yeah.
Just like, ooh. And then later they're like, we figure out they're hooking up.
Yep.
Just like very, very good there. Do I have any more LOLs? Oh, I really liked Tony talking about the craven vicissitudes of the American political system. Just like craven.
Craven
as a modifier for vicissitudes specifically is just so good. Yeah.
I've definitely been tempted to like use vicissitudes, and probably have, let's be honest, in writing at some point. So I'm like, well, that's a nice word.
That's a fun. I mean, it does. I imagine it probably doesn't sound good over a mic, so apologies, listeners. But it's like too many S's.
So many plosives. Yeah.
Did we miss anything hilarious?
I think we captured a lot of the other funny lines earlier as well. Peter's whole "I'm going to draw the Millennium Falcon and TIE Fighter," which interestingly paints like. So it's well established at that point that Hanaya is Han Solo and is the rebellion, and Ash is the Empire, which I did laugh at.
Yeah, so good.
As the person working in government.
I love it. I love it. Are we ready to conclude, perhaps?
Yes, I have one more comedy thing, but it comes up in my episode title.
Oh, great. Okay. Do you want to go first?
Yes,
Oh, yeah. Yours is probably better, but you can go first.
I've got executive summary on bovine medical procedures to mitigate the tombstone domino.
Awesome. I went with a document title, not an actual title, and I put sloppy science _ chaos of reality .docx. Yours is better.
No, I think we combine the two.
Combine them. Oh yeah, I like that.
Yeah, we'll figure that out in post.
Beautiful. Like, what do we do next?
Up next, we got 2 interludes coming up next before the next full chapter, the final chapter in book 2 of the Deluge. We've got a fun headline splash that includes a lot of not so fun things, and then we have one of my favorite interludes for this entire novel, which is a excerpt of a podcast interview with Kate Morris.
Ooh, are we going to play with form on that one, or?
I think we have to. We'll have to chat about that one off air and bring something to the people. And then we have, after that, Jackie 2, How to Stop a Revolution. also set in 2020.
So much to chew on. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in to We Are the Deluge.
And we are the Deluge.